She stood alone in the mud at 2 in the morning, holding the head of a 1,000-pound animal that every single expert had already given up on. No vet, no neighbor, no one coming. Just a widow, a dying horse, and something she couldn't explain, even to herself. What happened in that barn over the next 6 hours changed the way an entire county thought about grief, about stubbornness, and about what it actually means to refuse to let go. Before we get into this story, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Have you ever been told that something was already over, that the outcome was decided, the damage done, and the only reasonable thing left to do was walk away? Because this woman was told exactly that, by professionals, by people she trusted, and she made a choice that night that most people would call irrational. I want to know, what would you have done in her place? Drop your answer in the comments. And tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we tell the ones that almost didn't get told. Now, let me take you to Grady County, Tennessee, and to a woman named Bet. The land had been in the family for 61 years. Not the grand kind of farmland you see in magazines. No rolling hills perfectly lit by golden hour. No white fences freshly painted. This was working land, cracked in summer, swallowed in mud every March, stubborn and unbeautiful and completely irreplaceable. The kind of land that only means something to the people who've bled for it. Betty Callahan had lived on that property since she was 23 years old, when she married a man named Ord and moved from a rented apartment in Knoxville into a life she hadn't entirely planned for, but had embraced with everything she had. Ord was a quiet man, steady as timber, the kind of person who fixed things before you noticed they were broken. They built the farm together, not quickly, not easily, but together. They raised 2 children, buried 1 dog, lost 1 pregnancy, replaced the roof twice, and fell into the rhythm of a life that was honest, even when it was hard. Ord died on a Wednesday in November, 3 years before this story begins. Heart attack. Sudden, the way people always say, at least he didn't suffer, which is something they say for the living, not the dead. Bet was 57 years old, and she was, without any drama, completely alone on 60 acres with 4 horses, a part-time farmhand named Russ who came on weekends, and a grief she hadn't figured out how to carry yet. She kept going. That's the only way to describe it. She didn't thrive. She didn't collapse. She kept going. The farm stayed running. The horses were fed, the fences held, and Bet moved through her days with a kind of quiet efficiency that her daughter Faye, who called every Sunday from Nashville, described as "Mom being mom," which was both accurate and insufficient. The horse at the center of this story was named Cinder. Cinder was a 16-year-old quarter horse, dark bay with a white marking on her left foreleg that looked, depending on the light, like either a flame or a splash of paint. Ord had brought her home as a 3-year-old, and for reasons that were never fully articulated but completely understood between them, Cinder had become his horse in a way the others hadn't. He was the one who trained her, the one she nickered for at the gate, the one who spent Sunday mornings brushing her in silence, not because the brushing was necessary, but because the silence was. After Ord died, Cinder grieved. Bet knew how that sounded. She'd said it out loud once to her neighbor Pruitt, who had nodded politely in the way that meant he didn't believe her. But she'd seen it. The horse stopped eating with appetite. She stood at the far end of her paddock, away from the others. She was not sick. She was not injured. She was waiting for someone who was never coming back. Bet understood that completely. The 2 of them moved through those first months in parallel, a widow and a horse, each carrying something invisible and heavy, each finding a reason to get up in the morning that had less to do with hope than with habit. It wasn't beautiful, but it was real. Then 14 months after Ord's death, Cinder got sick. Not the quiet, grieving kind of sick. The acute, alarming, middle-of-the-night kind. It started on a Friday. Russ noticed it first. Cinder hadn't touched her hay by afternoon, which wasn't completely unusual, but she also wasn't moving right. A stiffness in her gait, a dullness in her eye. He mentioned it to Bet before he left that evening, and Bet went out to check. She ran her hands along the horse's neck, looked at her gums, pale, slightly off, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She called Dr. Such, the large animal vet who serviced most of the farms in Grady County. He was there within the hour, which told Bet he'd taken her concerns seriously. His examination was thorough and efficient. He checked gut sounds, took temperature, assessed the horse's posture and response. When he finished, he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and told Bet what he suspected: severe colic, possibly a displacement or worse, a twist in the large colon. "We need to get her to the clinic," he said, "tonight." The transport was difficult. Cinder resisted the trailer in the way a sick animal resists everything instinctively, as if some part of her sensed that movement meant danger. It took 40 minutes, and Bet walking her in slow circles under the yard light before she loaded. Bet followed the trailer in her truck, headlights carving through the dark Tennessee roads, hands at 10 and 2, jaw tight. At the clinic, the night staff was already prepped. They administered fluids and pain management immediately, and within 2 hours, Dr. Such had his answer: surgical colic, a right dorsal displacement. Serious, but the kind that sometimes resolved with controlled movement and medical management. He wanted to try conservative treatment first, given Cinder's age and condition. Better stayed until 4 in the morning. Such sent her home with instructions to sleep and a promise to call by 7. He called at 6:15. The conservative treatment wasn't working. Cinder had deteriorated overnight. Her vitals were unstable, her pain response elevated, and she had developed signs of laminitis in her front feet, a devastating secondary complication that, in a horse this age, with a compromised system, dramatically narrowed their options. Surgery was now the question on the table. "I have to be honest with you, Bet," Such said, and she could hear in his voice the particular weight of someone who has delivered difficult news enough times to know there is no good way to do it. She's 16. Her age, combined with the laminitis presentation and the stress her system is already under, surgery is high risk. We're talking about a recovery that could take 6 months, require around-the-clock care, and even then, the odds aren't favorable. Bet asked him what not favorable meant, specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe 30% that she survives the procedure and recovers to a reasonable quality of life. 30%. And if we don't do surgery? Another pause. Humane euthanasia, he said, sooner rather than later, to prevent suffering. Betta thanked him. She said she'd call him back. She sat in her kitchen in the grey morning light with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and thought about Ord brushing Cinder on Sunday mornings in the quiet. She thought about the way the horse had stood at the fence line for months after he died, waiting. She picked up the phone. "Do the surgery," she said. The surgery took 4 hours. Bet sat in the clinic's small waiting area, which smelled of antiseptic and hay and the particular anxiety of people who love animals. A young couple was there with a retriever. An older man sat alone with a paper cup of coffee, not drinking it. Nobody talked. The television on the wall was showing a morning show with the volume off. At one point, a vet tech named Dornell came out to update her. They were partway through. Cinder was stable, no new complications. Bet nodded and said thank you, and then sat back in the plastic chair and stared at the muted television and did not allow herself to calculate odds. When Dr. Such came out, he was still in his surgical clothes. He looked tired in the way surgeons look when something went harder than expected but not as badly as it could have. "She made it through," he said. Bet exhaled something she'd been holding for 6 hours. "But," he said, and that word landed like a stone in still water, "the recovery is going to be the real battle. The laminitis is my primary concern right now. If we can't manage the rotation in those front feet, we're going to face this decision again." He explained what the next weeks would require. Stall rest, strict, specialized shoeing. He'd be bringing in a farrier named Bowen, who had experience with laminitic cases. Medications administered on a precise schedule. Monitoring that was essentially continuous. and pain management that required someone present, observant, and willing to act immediately if anything changed. "Do you have the help for that?" he asked. Not unkindly, practically. Bette said yes. She didn't entirely have the help for that. Russ came on weekends. She had two neighbors, Pruitt on the east side, a woman named Florrie on the west, who were friendly but not close in the way that meant you called them at midnight. She had her daughter Faye 3 hours away in Nashville, and a son named Lev in Portland who worked in tech and had not been back to Tennessee in 14 months. But she said yes, because the alternative was to say no, and she was not going to do that. She drove back to the farm alone, made a list, and started making calls. Faye drove down that weekend. She was 31, practical, and had her father's habit of fixing things before you noticed they were broken. She stayed for 5 days, took the night shifts without being asked, and set up a baby monitor system in the barn that linked to a receiver in the farmhouse so Bette could hear Cinder's movements while she slept, or tried to sleep. "Mom," Faye said on the third night, sitting across from Bette at the kitchen table at 11 p.m. "You know there's a point where we might have to—" "I know," Bette said. "I'm just saying that if she's suffering—" "I know, Faye." A silence. "She's not suffering yet," Bette said. "She's fighting." Faye looked at her mother's face for a long moment. Then she nodded and poured them both another cup of coffee. Bowen, the farrier, arrived on a Tuesday. He was a compact, unhurried man in his late 40s who said very little until he'd finished his assessment, and then said exactly what he thought without softening it. He examined Cinder's front feet carefully, studied the x-rays Such had sent him, and made a sound that Bette categorized as not optimistic, but not hopeless. "She's got rotation in both fronts," he said. "Left is worse. We're going to do therapeutic shoeing, heart bars, deep bedding, very specific angles. It's not going to be comfortable for her at first." He looked at Bette directly. "And I need to be honest, this only works if the underlying condition is controlled. If the laminitis keeps progressing, the shoeing won't save her." "What do you need from me?" Bette asked. "Ice therapy twice a day on the front feet. Strict confinement. I mean strict. She cannot be moving more than necessary, and you're going to need to weigh every pound of hay she eats, because simple sugars will make this worse." He paused. "And she needs calm. Horses in pain do better when they're not stressed. She needs her environment to be consistent and quiet." Bette absorbed all of this. "When can you start?" "I'm here now," he said. Watching Bowen work was an education in patience. He shaped and fitted and adjusted with a focus that reminded Bette of Ord working on the tractor engine. That same complete absorption in the task, the same refusal to rush. Cinder stood with the careful stillness of an animal in pain. But she let him work. She pressed her nose once against Bette's shoulder, and Bette put a hand on her neck and kept it there. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the recovery. Bette restructured her entire life around Cinder's schedule. She was in the barn at 5:30 in the morning, and again at noon, and again at 6 in the evening. She administered medications, monitored feed, documented everything in a notebook she kept hung on a nail inside the stall door. She iced the feet with the specialty boots Such had recommended. She called the clinic every other day and answered their questions carefully and completely. Her neighbor Pruitt, who had doubted Bette's account of Cinder's grief, started stopping by. He didn't say much. He was a man of Ord's generation, where presence substituted for words. But he helped with the other horses, which freed up hours Bette desperately needed. She thanked him once, and he waved it off, which was the language they both understood. Florrie brought food twice a week. Not charity. She framed it as too much in the pot, which Bette accepted, which was also a language. Lev called. Every few days, then every day. He asked practical questions, which was his way of caring. He looked up research papers on equine laminitis recovery and read sections of them to Bette over the phone, which she listened to patiently even when she already knew the content. It was not about the information, it was about the call. Then, 3 weeks in, Cinder stopped eating again. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of cold that belongs to late February, not dramatic, just relentless. Bet had gone to the barn at 5:30 as usual and found Cinder standing in the corner of her stall with that dull-eyed stillness that Bet had learned to read, like a language she wished she didn't know. She called Sutch immediately. He came within 2 hours. His examination was careful, and his face during it was the particular careful blankness of someone who is not letting themselves telegraph their conclusions. When he finished, he washed his hands at the barn sink and dried them slowly. "It's not a new colic episode," he said. "Her gut sounds are fine." He paused. "Her vitals are acceptable. There's no acute crisis right now." "Then what is it?" Bet asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when a horse has been through this level of trauma, surgical, then laminitis, then weeks of confinement, there's a psychological element. They stop engaging. They stop trying." He looked at Cinder, who was not looking at anything. "It's not something I can medicate. It's something she has to decide." Bette stared at him. "You're telling me she's given up. I'm telling you she might be close to it." After he left, Bette stood in the stall for a long time. The other horses moved in the paddock outside, their breath visible in the cold air. The light through the barn windows was thin and grey. Cinder stood with her head low, and Bet stood next to her, and neither of them moved. Then Bet did something she hadn't done in front of anyone, or alone, in a very long time. She talked. Not the clipped, functional communication of caretaking, not instructions or assessments. She talked the way she had talked to Ord in their best years, when the farm was dark and the kids were asleep, and they sat on the porch and said everything that was too large for daylight. She told Cinder about the first winter she and Ord had spent on this farm, when the heating system failed and they slept in the living room next to an old wood stove and thought it was the hardest thing they'd ever done and were completely wrong about that. She told her about the time Faye, at age 8, had convinced herself she could train one of the other horses to jump by building a series of broomstick fences in the paddock, and how Ord had watched it from the fence rail with his arms crossed and the specific face he made when he was trying not to laugh. She told Cinder about the last Sunday morning, the last one, when Ord had gone out early and she had watched from the kitchen window, not joining him because the morning was his and the horse was his, and some things you don't interrupt. She talked for 40 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of it, Cinder raised her head. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie moment. It was just a horse lifting her head, shifting her weight, and pressing her nose toward the hay rack, in the way an animal presses toward something it has decided tentatively to want. Bette stood very still. Then she got the hay. The night it nearly ended for good was a Saturday, 5 weeks post-surgery, 2.5 weeks since the eating crisis, and Cinder had been improving. Not quickly, not in a way that felt like victory, but in the accumulating way that recovery actually works. She was eating. Her pain response was reducing. Bowen had come back twice to adjust the shoeing, and his most recent assessment had contained the word promising, which Bet had repeated to herself 4 times after he left. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees by nightfall. Bette had done the last check at 10 p.m. Medications administered, feet iced, feed measured and consumed, water bucket full. Cinder had looked at her with something that was not quite the old light, but was adjacent to it. Bette had touched her forehead and told her good night and gone inside. The baby monitor woke her at 1:47 in the morning, not with a sound exactly, with the absence of the right sounds. Cinder moved in a particular rhythm when she was resting, a slow shift of weight, an occasional exhale, the brush of her nose against the wall. Bette had memorized that rhythm without meaning to. What came through the monitor instead was irregular, fast, wrong. She was in the barn in 7 minutes, coat pulled over her pajamas, boots on the wrong feet. Cinder was down, not the controlled, deliberate way a horse lowers itself to rest, the other way. She was on her side, legs moving in the cycling motion that every horse person learns to fear. Her breathing was labored. Her eyes were showing white at the edges. Bette was on her phone to the emergency line at the clinic before she'd fully processed what she was seeing. The on-call tech, a young man named Stellan, answered on the second ring and talked her through the immediate steps while she worked. Get her up if possible, keep her moving, check the gums for color. Getting a down horse up is not a gentle process. It requires pressure and positioning, and a combination of calm voice and physical insistence. Bet was 59 years old, alone, in a barn at 12 degrees, trying to convince a 1,000-pound animal in distress to stand. She did it by doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, which is how most impossible things get done. It took 11 minutes. Cinder got up. She stood with her legs splayed and her head hanging, breathing hard, shaking. Bet put herself directly in front of her and put both hands on the sides of the horse's face and said out loud, to the horse, to the dark barn, to whatever was listening, "Not tonight. We are not doing this tonight." Such arrived at 2:40. He'd driven 40 minutes through the dark at a speed that the roads didn't technically permit, because Bet's voice on the emergency line had communicated something that transcended the medical details. His assessment confirmed what Bet had feared and handled: another colic episode, likely triggered by the cold affecting gut motility, caught early enough that intervention had not gone past the point of return. He administered medication, walked Cinder in the barn aisle, slowly, methodically, for 90 minutes, monitoring her every few steps. Bette walked on the other side. They didn't talk much. The horse moved between them, and the barn was cold, and the night outside was very dark, and none of that mattered. At 4:15, Such stopped walking and examined Cinder again. He listened for a long time with his stethoscope, moved it, listened again. Bet watched his face. Then something changed in it. "Gut sounds," he said. Not explaining, just saying it. The way you say something out loud because the relief requires witness. Bet closed her eyes for a moment. "She's not clear yet," he said. "I want to stay another hour, but—" He stopped. "I wasn't sure we were going to get here, Bet. When you called 5 weeks ago and I gave you those odds, I want you to know I've thought about this case a lot. About you being here alone doing what you've been doing." He looked at the horse, then at her. "I don't know what you're made of, but I haven't seen many people sustain this kind of vigil." Bet looked at Cinder, who was standing steadier now, one ear beginning to rotate forward with returning awareness. "She needed someone to not give up on her," Bet said. "That's all I did." Such shook his head slowly. "That's not a small thing." They walked the horse for another hour. By 5:30, the crisis had passed. Such left as the sky was beginning to go grey at the horizon, with instructions, check-in calls scheduled for every 4 hours, and a quiet word at his truck before he drove away. "She's a different horse than she was 2 hours ago," he said. "Keep doing what you're doing." Bet stood in the driveway and watched his taillights disappear, and then stood there for another moment in the cold pre-dawn, not ready to go inside yet. The barn light was on behind her. Inside it, Cinder stood in her stall, alive. Bet went back in. She sat in the folding chair she'd put in the corner of the stall weeks ago, wrapped in a barn blanket that smelled of dust and hay, and she watched the horse breathe. Cinder's ear swiveled toward her. Her nose dropped once, searching. Bette reached up and touched it. "I know," she said. "Me too." She sat there until the sun came up. March arrived like an apology. Mild mornings, the ground beginning to give, the horses in the paddock moving with the particular electricity that comes when winter starts to loosen its hold. Bette stood at the fence with her coffee and watched them. The other three out there in the pale morning light, and Cinder, still in the smaller turnout pen, still restricted, but with more movement permitted now, beginning to use herself differently. The laminitis was receding. Bowen had come for what he said might be his second-to-last therapeutic visit, and his assessment had contained more than promising. He'd used the word recovering without qualification, and had spent 20 minutes showing Bet the X-ray comparisons on his phone, the rotation measurements, the before and after, the trajectory he said he hadn't expected to see going this direction. "She's an unusual horse," he said, which Bet suspected was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Such had called her into the clinic to review the full case, not because anything was wrong, but to walk through what the long-term picture looked like. Managed maintenance, annual monitoring, careful diet in perpetuity, some limitation on work. But a life, he said. A good one. How long? Bette asked. Could be another 5 years. Could be more. There's no prediction with this kind of recovery. He paused. I'll be honest. When we did the surgery, I thought the kindest outcome was a peaceful few weeks and then a humane decision. I've been doing this a long time. I've seen what I expected to see, and I've been surprised occasionally. He looked at her. This is the most surprised I've been in about 8 years. Bette drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold. Faye called that evening. Bette told her the update, the real one, the numbers and the prognosis and what Bowen had said. There was a silence on the line, the kind that precedes something Faye was working out how to say. I wasn't sure she was going to make it, Mum, she said finally. I didn't say that. I should have. I didn't believe. I know, Bette said. But you did. Bette thought about that, about what believing actually was in practice, whether it was certainty or just refusal, whether it required hope or just stubbornness, whether the difference mattered. I believed she deserved someone to stay, she said. That's what I could hold on to. By April, Cinder was walking in the pasture. Not running. Running was not in the near-term plan and might never be fully in the plan, which was fine. But walking in the way that means something. Moving through the grass with her nose down, investigating the spring growth, pausing to look at things with that particular horse attention that has no object but itself. Being present, being alive. Russ, who had been watching this recovery from a careful distance, helpful on weekends, quietly worried on the days Bette had called him with updates, stood at the fence one Saturday morning and watched her for a while without saying anything. Then he said, huh, which, from Russ, was the equivalent of a speech. Lev came home in May. He'd arranged time off, something he hadn't done in over 2 years, and he drove from Nashville. He'd flown into Nashville with a bag that suggested he wasn't planning to stay 2 days. He ended up staying 10. He learned how to ice Cinder's feet properly. He learned how to measure hay by weight. He learned how to sit in the barn in the evening without needing the silence to be filled. On his 3rd night, he and Bette sat on the porch after dinner, which was something they hadn't done together in longer than either of them wanted to calculate. Dad used to sit out here, he said. After the kids went to bed. He'd have a beer and watch the pasture. He never wanted company for that. No, Bette said, but he liked knowing I was inside. A long quiet. I think I understand that better now than I did, Lev said. Bette looked at her son, who looked in this light, in this moment, in a way that made her breath catch, like the man who had taught him without trying to. He'd be glad you came, she said. The summer was good, not in the way that erases what came before. Grief doesn't work that way, and Bette had stopped waiting for it to. But good in the way that is earned. The farm ran, the horses were cared for. Cinder gained weight, her coat coming in with a luster that hadn't been there since before Ord died. She began recognizing Bette across the pasture in the old way. Head up, ears forward, that movement toward the fence that means a creature has a reason to come to you. There was a morning in July, one of those clear mornings that feel like they've been made specifically to be noticed, when Bette went out early, earlier than usual, before coffee, before planning, and stood at Cinder's fence just to stand there. The light was at that angle where everything is briefly gold. The horse came to her without being called. Bette put her hand on Cinder's neck, in the hollow behind the jaw, where Ord always said you could feel a horse's heartbeat if you were patient enough. She stood there a long time. She could feel it. In September, a woman from a farm 2 counties over called Bette. Her name was Paloma, and she had a horse in early-stage laminitis, and she'd gotten Bette's name from Bowen, who had described her as someone who knows what this takes. Bette talked to her for an hour and 15 minutes. She told her everything she knew, the practical things, the schedules and the medications and the weight of the hay, but also the other things. The way you have to decide every morning that you're going to stay. The way there is no single moment of recovery, just accumulation. The way being present for an animal in crisis is not about knowing all the answers. It is about refusing to leave the room. How do you keep going when it feels impossible? Paloma asked. Bet thought about a barn in February at 2 in the morning. She thought about Ord on Sunday mornings. She thought about a horse that learned to wait for someone who never came back. And then, slowly, with difficulty over a very long time, learned to wait for someone who stayed. You just do the next thing, she said, and then the one after that. And eventually the next thing is something better. I've told you this story the way it was told to me. Through documents, through accounts, through the kind of details that don't get invented, because no one would think to invent them. But I think what stays with me isn't the medical improbability of it, or even the physical feat of a woman alone in a winter barn doing what she did. It's the part that came before any of that. The part where everyone who was supposed to know, who had the training and the instruments and the experience, said it was over. And one person, who had no credential except love and stubbornness and an unwillingness to leave, said, "Not yet. There's something in that worth holding on to. We are often told what is reasonable, what the odds are, when to walk away and when to save ourselves the additional grief. And sometimes that guidance is right and wise and kind. But sometimes, the unreasonable thing is the true thing, and the person who refuses to let go turns out to be the person who was paying the most attention all along." Bet didn't know Cinder was going to survive. She just knew she wasn't going to be the reason she didn't. If that moved you, if you've had a moment like that where you refuse to give up on something or someone, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who needs this story today, send it to them. Sometimes the right words arrive at exactly the right time. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.